Hello. There are figures in counterculture whose names appear only in the margins of the story, whose influence is essential yet often overshadowed by louder, more mythologized personalities. I'm not one of them, but I'm Stephen and this is the Bureau of Lost Culture, and today we're going to bring one of those stories into sharper focus. We previously made an episode about musician, artist, arch provocateur Genesis P-Orridge, but my guest today is Alaura O'Dell, known to many listeners under her earlier name Paula P-Orridge, musician, artist, occult practitioner, co-conspirator in the band Psychic TV, and one of the key architects of the Temple Ov Psychick Youth during its most active years, as we're going to hear. Now, for a long time, Alaura was described almost exclusively in relation to her then husband, Genesis P-Orridge. But her life didn't end when she parted ways with the band, with Genesis, or with the Temple. In fact, in many ways, it began anew, and we're going to be hearing more about that in the second part of our interview in a future episode. Today we're going to hear about Alaura's life before Genesis in London, the formative years of Psychic TV, the chaos, the energy, the experiments with magic and media, the birth of the Temple of Psychic Youth, TOPY as it was called, this global network of seekers and outsiders where she wasn't merely a participant but an organiser, the one who handled the workings, the practical magic, you could say, behind the grand metaphysical gestures. And we're going to hear about the neglected, erased, and often underplayed role of women in the making of counterculture and the music industry. Plus, growing up in Hackney, Kathmandu, getting raided by the police, being described as a Satanist, and Liberace. Yeah, really, that Liberace. Let's do it. I am very pleased to be sitting here in London talking across the Atlantic, across the airwaves to Alaura O'Dell. Alaura, welcome to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Hello. Yeah, it's morning here. Thank you so much for inviting me on. Very happy to be here.
Let's forget that it was 2025 in Sonoma County or in London. Let's backtrack to 1963. You were born, one of those rare people that I know now is actually born in London and in Westminster, right?
Yeah, I was born in Westminster. That sounds incredibly posh and it's on my passport, but my mum had gone up to the West End with my aunt and it was like the coldest winter on record, I guess, at that time. And she slipped in the snow, basically went into labour. So she went Charing Cross Hospital. My mum was from Fulham. So I spent, I think it's the first 6 years of my life in Fulham.
For listeners who are not from the UK, Fulham's a district, one of London's villages in the southwest, now quite posh. I'm not sure if it was then, was it?
No, my family's very working class. My dad was a bank robber in the 60s. Someone recently was like, so did he know the great train robbers? Yeah, I found out later after he passed away that they asked him to do the great train robbery. And apparently my dad was like, what day? And he goes, no, I got a job that day. I did that one. And I was like, thank God.
When your dad said he had a job that day, did he mean like, yeah, I'm actually working on a building site, or did he mean I'm actually doing a burglary or something that day?
It was like, I got a bank robbery or something. And my parents divorced and then I'd get letters from my dad. And I didn't see my dad forever. And I was like, and he would write, I know you want a ventriloquist dummy for Christmas, but where I am right now, they don't make them for little girls. And I'm thinking, my dad's on a desert island, but he's incarcerated.
When he wrote and you thought, oh, Dad's on a desert island, which is a lovely sort of image, despite missing him, he was actually inside, was he? He was banged up.
Yeah, he lived on King's Road forever. And they'd all hang out at this coffee shop on King's Road. And the stories that they had about being in Wellwood Scrubs, like they could bribe all the guards, they could get special food in. I was just gobsmacked. Very colourful life. Yeah, and then my mum got together with my stepdad, and then he moved us into slum housing in Hackney, just off London Fields, which is also quite gentrified now. You know, I still have friends there. I have friends from primary school. I went to London Fields Primary School, and we're still amazingly in contact. I think part of it is a lot of people don't move away.
Yeah. Probably one of the areas people have stayed in most. But of course now it's hipster central. I mean, London feels Broadway market, even in my time in this city, you know, radically changed. You know, I remember when Broadway market was eel pie and mash shops, a couple of betting shops, maybe some charity shops, Greasy Spoon Cafe. And then I remember a few years ago sort of cycling down it, and there was like a shop selling posh pastries. There was a bike shop that also served like gourmet coffee.
I used to go to Broadway Market as a kid. I mean, my mum used to send me around when I was like 6 or 7 with a shopping list. And then when I later married to Jen, I used to go there every day and buy my groceries. It was really the butcher, the baker, you know, the candlestick maker. And now, I can go get an oat milk matcha latte. It's so changed. I wasn't really cognizant at the time, but at some point I became aware that I was playing on bomb sites as a kid.
Right.
Because it was one of the last places to rebuild, and the East End was heavily bombed.
It was absolutely smashed to pieces, wasn't it? Which is why there's so many, you know, what we would call council estates, what they call projects in America, in amongst what used to be posh houses in Hackney. Proper kind of mashup, isn't it?
Really is. It was rough. Harold Pinter, he's from Hackney, and he went to Hackney Downs, I think, which was the boys' school close to my school. But it was rough. Like, there was gangs and stuff like that. And Harold Pinter, he said, you know, we would go to the Jewish club, and I think it was on Ridley Road. And he said we would come out and there were gangs waiting for us. And you had 2 choices. You would run as fast as you could, or you would pick up a bottle and smash it and, you know, fight back. It was really, really quite rough. You got a lot of street smarts. I was pretty lucky in general. I had a little group of boys who would always look out for me. So, I mean, there was a lot of drug addiction. I remember coming out of Beck Road once, and there was a policeman, and I started talking to him. And he said there were 15 known heroin dealers in the radius of our house. So that was early 80s.
70s and the 80s, I think, in Britain were tough times, weren't they? You know, sort of economic deprivation, unemployment, you know, striking and all the kind of, and then the state cracking down on unions, and smack addiction was going on as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way I was naive to it. A bunch of us kids would just hang out there, and a few of those, mainly boys, had ended up dying of heroin addiction.
Tough place to grow up. Of course, you born Paula Jean Brooking, right? Later became Paula P-Orridge. Now you're Alaura O'Dell. Let's just go back. London schoolgirl, you've got ideas about what you're going to do the rest of your life, but then this thing happened, a sort of signal moment in your life, wasn't it? That this meeting, which happened when you were sort of 15 or 16, but tell us about the circumstances around that. What happened?
So I didn't go to school very much. I truanted a lot because there were these horrible, horrible bullies, and they'd wait for you at the school gate. And even though I truanted a lot, I was always in the second class. And I was studying for my A-levels, English and sociology. Weekends and after school, I had all these jobs. I had my first job at 10 working down Ridley Market. And then on Saturdays, I worked at the top of Broadway Market in the little supermarket. And this man would come in that I actually recognized because when I was about 8, I came out of primary school. My mum was there, and this man walks past, and he's got a triangle shaved out of the front of his head, and he looked weird. One mother went, "Oh my God, that's that bent pornographer." And I just remember, like, what's a pornographer? And I guess it was, you know, around the time Jen was doing the ICA prostitution show. So I recognized Jen.
Because I think it got into the national press, didn't it? You know, writing off as this disgraceful thing that the ICA had put on. So it sort of infamy rather than fame had sort of spread to the East End even, right?
Exactly, infamy. So I was working in this supermarket, and Jen would come in, and he would buy a pound of sugar and then stand and talk to me. And then a line would build up of people, and then he'd leave. And then about an hour later, he'd come back and buy a box of tea and talk to me. And then he started inviting me over to his house. Like, "Oh, I just live around the corner. You can drop in anytime and have a cup of tea." And I'm thinking, he's a bit weird.
Do you think this sort of staggered shopping technique of his was just a way to get so he can carry on talking to you in the shop?
Oh, absolutely. I probably thought, oh, he's absent-minded. And I'm also thinking, why would he want to talk to a 16-year-old, you know? My world wasn't very big, but I was hanging out with an interesting group of school. We were all a bit punky, and we would go down to King's Road as much as we could. Actually, my dad lived on King's Road. So yeah, Jen kept inviting me over. And I don't know how long it took, maybe a couple of years. And he said, you'll see my light on. I stay up all night. And one night I was like, it was cold and I didn't want to go home. And I just knocked on his door. And then I hear this dog barking. And then this person going, go away. And I was like, it's me. And then I hear like 50,000 locks undoing on the door. I suppose the door opening literally to a different world that I had been exposed to.
You stepped through that door, right? And then was that it? Your relationship began?
I had a boyfriend then. I didn't feel like I'm attracted to this person. I mean, Jen was very cute then. And he had this androgyny thing that I'm definitely attracted to. But I had this boyfriend. But yeah, after a couple of years, I remember he walked me home one night. I think I turned 18 and then he was like, oh, can I kiss you? And I was like, I don't think I've ever been asked for a kiss. You know, like boys just kiss you. Then we got together and then Throbbing Gristle were doing their last 3 concerts. They were doing London at the Lyceum and then coming to California. So I went to the Lyceum gig. I remember Cabaret Voltaire actually performed. And then he said to me, so what are you going to do when you leave school? I said, well, I think I'm going to go to Portsmouth Poly to do my degree in sociology. And I remember him going, do you want to go to college or do you want to travel the world with me? Because he said, oh, we're going to California, you should come. But I had to get a job because I realized he wasn't going to pay for me. And so I got a job. And
that's quite a bold thing to do. You're 18. But you're doing your A-levels. You've got an idea about what you want to do, what you want to be. And okay, you're in a relationship with this, and obviously a very compelling person. As you say, super cute in those days, right? I love these sort of signposts along the way, these kind of, you know, the road forks. You can take 2 paths. You've got to choose, right? Now, a lot of people, and maybe I'm amongst them, are not necessarily going to go forget the A-levels, forget all that plan. Let's go down this road and see what happens.
I don't remember what I was thinking because it was such a dream of mine, more than a dream, to get out of Hackney. I was being propositioned with an adventure. Come to California with me.
There was a lot of other people you were meeting as well, right? It wasn't just Jen. There was a whole group of people in that kind of artistic countercultural circle at the time. And that must have been quite a blast as well, right?
It really was. I listened to your interview with John Savage. And John came over pretty regularly to Jen's house. And I just took an instant liking to John. You know, he was smart, you know, interesting, cute. And then all these people would drop round, like Cabaret Voltaire. There was that for me as well. Like, I am meeting such interesting people. I wanted my world to be broader.
And then later, I mean, you met Burroughs and Guyson, didn't you, as well? I mean, I would find Burroughs a bit difficult, I suspect, but you said Guyson was very nice, right?
Jen had said, let's go over to Paris before we went to California, which was in May. You know, I want you to meet my friend Brian. We went to Paris, and I can recall that visit as if it was yesterday. Brian had an apartment opposite the Beaubourg, you know, the Charles Pompidou. And we went into Geison's apartment and it was stepping into this exotic world of Moroccan music playing, Moroccan rugs everywhere. And the other person who was there was Bashir Attar. I believe he's still the head of the Jujuka musicians. And it was the first time that I got to experience the dream machine. It was set up in probably a room that was a bedroom, and they explained to look at it with your eyes closed. And I'm thinking, with your eyes closed? Oh my gosh, it was such an incredible experience. You know, I hadn't taken any psychedelics at that point, but it was like being on psychedelics.
Yeah.
And then I remember Brian making us tea, and he said, oh, you can join me in the kitchen. And I remember him saying, you can't let the bubbles get bigger than fish eyes to have the tea perfect. And when I told someone recently, they were like, yeah, but fish eyes are all different sizes. But I was like, oh yeah. But he was the kindest, sweetest, gracious person. And I remember him being very laid back and very mellow. Burroughs, I didn't interact with that much, but I remember him holding Caress. She was not more than about 6 weeks old, I think. And I remember being backstage, and he took Caress and he was holding Caress. And he was like, oh, they're just like cats. They're just... And I was like, oh my God, give me back my baby. But I could not connect with him. And
Right.
I was reading Patti Smith recently, and they had this friendship, and I just thought, wow, bless her heart, she must have found this way to connect with him. But Brian was the epitome of the word gentleman.
So, because all these people that come into your life, you go travelling, but actually you're not just travelling. Quite quickly, you're deep into the music and the whole thing around it as well.
We actually got married on that trip to California, on a day trip to Tijuana that wasn't planned. Don Bowles, who was the drummer of the Germs, who was a friend of Jen's, and Jerry Drever, who is an incredible artist, said, you've got a day off, let's go to Mexico for the day. And there was a sign for marriages and divorces. And they were like, oh, you should get married. And Jen's like, yeah, I don't have any money on me. And they were like, we'll pay. And I realized I didn't even think about what that meant. I thought, we'll just do it as a fun thing to do. But anyway, we got married and went back to London. And then I was still living with my mom. Had to tell my mom, no, I said I got married. And she went, oh, that means you're moving out. But anyway, I moved in with Jen, and next door was a couple of members of the collective and band 23 Skidoo. I can't remember who invited me, whether it was Alex or Johnny or Fritz, but they were like, what are you doing at the weekend? And I was like, oh, I don't think I have anything. And they were like, oh, do you want to come play percussion with us? And so I ended up doing a few gigs with 23 Skidoo. Then quite quickly, Jen formed Psychic TV. And then I was invited to be part of that collective. And then that was it. I was in the band and traveling and doing gigs. I'm on the first album, but just doing a couple of lyrics. And then I was actually much more involved in the second album. And then we set up Temple Records Limited. Then later it was TOPY, and we had a mail order, and I was running the mail order side of that.
This is a sidebar about the Temple of Psychick Youth, or TOPY as it's called. TOPY was a network, an experiment, an art project, an occult order possibly, a cult depending on who you ask and how deeply they were involved. The Temple's genesis, in both senses of that word, lies in the implosion of Throbbing Gristle, the pioneering industrial group who described themselves as anti-pop. And when they split in 1981, their frontman, Genesis P-Orridge, didn't simply want to form another band. So the new group, Psychic TV, was conceived as a multimedia organism, an ongoing experiment in the fusion of art and magic. And woven into that early fabric of Psychic TV was the idea of this wider network to challenge what William Burroughs had called the control systems. So in 1981, the Temple was born. And like all good occult or quasi-occult movements, TOPY had a central text, the Grey Book, his Bible, part mystical manual, part psychological handbook, part radical art manifesto, laying out practical techniques for altering consciousness. One of these, which we're going to hear about in more detail, sigilization, the practice of condensing a desire or intention into a symbolic form charged with sexual energy, based in part on the teachings of Aleister Crowley and of course the art of Austin Osman Spare, outlining psychic exercises, meditation rituals and anti-conditioning methods. Now what made TOPY unusual was its collectivity. The members were encouraged to send in their signals, physical handmade objects charged with orgasmic energy, to the Temple Central Cell, also known as Alaura, Paula, at the time, where they were archived. There were TOPY stations in the UK, Europe, North America. It was a World Wide Web before the World Wide Web, an early digital age consciousness movement built with stamps, photocopiers, cassette tapes, and a lot of work. And at the centre of it, of course, was psychic TV, whose live performances often served as semi-ritual events, part concert, part invocation, part communal psychodrama. TOPY attracted an extraordinary range of individuals: artists, occultists, queers, punks, cyberpunks, dreamers, runaways, performance makers, musicians, kink practitioners, writers and seekers. And there they found a home. For some, TOPY was a safe haven. For others, it was an experiment. For more, it was simply a community with a potent aesthetic. The group's imagery, the psychic cross, the sigils, the dense text lore seeped into industrial culture. Techno, rave, body modification, communities, avant-garde performance, and even contemporary witchcraft. By the late 80s, TOPY had become an object of fascination and fear to segments of the British press. A moral panic, as we will hear, fueled by sensational reporting. This, in some ways, brought about the end of TOPY. Psychic TV continued, but the temple structure, by the 1990s, had effectively ceased to function. It is kind of interesting. It's this kind of little ecosystem around this band collective project, right? And you're straight in there, you're playing drums, you're in the band, you're contributing lyrics, but you're also basically kind of running the show as well, right?
Yeah. And then, so we got married in May 81. The following year, our eldest daughter, Caress, was born in August. And then 2 years and 9 months after that, our second daughter was born. And I just remember having 2 young children. Not having to, but running this mail order company. And I was talking recently to someone about, they wanted me to order something for them and send it to England because they couldn't get it in England. And I said, okay, I'll do that for you, but I don't really want to go to the post office. And I realized I had PTSD about going to the post office because I would literally walk to the post office on Cambridge Heath Road, for people who know Hackney. It was the big post office. And I had a baby in a pram, a toddler. I literally had about 50 parcels that I packaged myself that had to go. I did a lot behind the scenes to keep things going. And, Jem was working really hard, doing the record company as well. But I was fully 100% involved in creative projects.
So this is one of the things you and I were talking about a bit earlier, isn't it? So as you said to me, when you get just referred to as the muse in this whole thing, you said it makes you gag because what you're remembering is, yeah, okay, you may have been a muse and the inspiration for various songs and involved in the creative life of the whole thing, but you're also the person who has to go to the post office with the packages and two little kids and do the tour managing, which is not muse stuff, is it? It's actually grind, a lot of it, isn't it?
You took the word out of my mouth. It was a frigging grind, and I got a lot of fulfillment from doing it. That was one of the hardest things when I did get kicked out of Psychic TV, when my relationship with Jen dissolved, because that had been my whole life. Overnight, I lost my home, my work, my creative projects, and also my family, So, but yeah, being referred to as a muse, oh my God, don't make me throw up when I know what I was doing.
From the outside, things can often seem a particular way. So artistic endeavours can seem kind of like crazy and transgressive and pushing the boundaries and very countercultural. But if you're running a record label, you're making your own music, and you've got this thing, Temple Ov Psychick Youth, which was, in a way, a kind of very strange fan club, wasn't it? This kind of community of people who were sort of deeply into the soul of what was going on. You have to be quite organised, don't you? And then you've got 2 kids. And I think what strikes me, Genesis, despite all the transgressive stuff, which without any doubt was there, in some ways was super traditional. I mean, he wooed you, right, over a period of time, and you got married. Not a very countercultural thing to do. I mean, all right, it's in Tijuana and it's kind of one of those places you can go in and get married on the spot. But, and then, you have 2 little kids. This isn't the stuff that, in a way, most people associate with deeply countercultural, radical people, is it? In some ways, it's very domestic.
There was definitely a very domestic side, and yet there was a huge juxtaposition of TOPY and Jen's ideas. I mean, not long into the marriage, he was talking about opening the marriage up and, seeing other people. But on saying that, there was this domestic side of Jen. I remember thinking after we had Caress, my fantasy was to move to a country cottage, be in the countryside and have like 5 children, and just that dream of family. Because my childhood family was so fractured. Jen was a great dad in many ways, and he was really good with the children. And yet that relationship and the family became quite chaotic.
If he's talking about opening the relationship up, this thing that religions control your sexuality and, we've got to push the envelope. And, how was that for you?
It was really challenging, but I was really young. When I met Jen, I was 15 going on 16. Jen was 13 years older than me. I look back and I know now that I hadn't found my voice.
Yeah.
So much of it, I felt I didn't have a choice. So when he was saying, let's open up the relationship, I felt that I actually didn't have a choice, that it wasn't a question or a conversation. It was like, this is what we're going to do.
Because you said that, when you moved into the house, he still got all the images from the prostitution show, the ICA, with Cozy in these, hardcore porn poses, right? Obviously, she's talked about that since. You're a young person, you're in that situation, and quite intimidating. You might be in love with somebody, but intimidating in the sense that, like, well, you're not very formed, so, like, you don't know, am I supposed to do this? Is that you might feel uneasy about it or, reluctant, an uncertainty about your own strength. When we're sort of at late teens and early 20s, we don't know that, do we? We don't know really where we stand in some ways.
Exactly. The counterbalance for all of it was that we didn't have that term then, love bombing.
Right.
I think that's really what I was experiencing. Jen took me on one incredible date that, I'll never forget that. It was like yesterday. He took me to see Liberace.
What?
The Palladium. And it was, I would never have chosen to see Liberace on my own. Like, Liberace? But he had this interest, and it was an incredible show. Michael Jackson was in the audience, and it was before he became super famous again. But I look back and I'm like, there was that love bombing where, Jen was telling me how much he loved me, and, like we'd go out up into the West End, and I think I owned one pair of shoes, and we saw a pair of shoes. I was like, they're really cute. And he's like, I'll buy you those shoes. And I was a girl. I was a teenager. It's like you're being hypnotized by it. And yet, as I was saying, I was meeting these really interesting people, and my world was opening, and I enjoyed having these intellectual conversations with people. Jen really was one of the most intelligent people that I've ever met, but there can be a danger to that intelligence.
And I suppose also if you love somebody, you want to please them, don't you? You want to...
Yeah.
Particularly the experience levels are quite different. It's more difficult, isn't it, to be clear about what you want to do. And I suppose also everything Rolling Ranger is experimental, the music's experimental, the images that have been made are experimental. So, and somebody's saying, well, let's extend that to the bedroom. And it's like, well, how do you draw the lines?
Yeah. And, looking back on my relationship, I really value my freedom and my independence now. And just seeing that for a very short time with Jen, I felt that I had freedom. And then after that, I didn't have the freedom. To be honest, I feel like I actually have like trauma and PTSD around that whole period of my life. I don't want to say I'm a survivor, but I managed as well as I could to be in a relationship that became very difficult. Obviously, knew that I probably couldn't continue in psychic TV after I left the marriage, but it was something that I had to do to have a life and keep on living.
You stayed silent for many years, and it's only more recently, really, that you've started to talk about it. Do you feel that you're ready now, or you've come to terms with it enough that you can actually communicate about it a bit more openly?
Yeah, growing up in Hackney, met Jen, had this whole life with Jen. I was with him for 11 years. Pretty much all the original psychic TV recordings I was on. A little fact, I'm not sure if you know that we were in the Guinness Book of Records.
I didn't know that.
Because we released the most amount of albums, recordings in 1 year. And it was because we were releasing live album series, and they were all released in 1 year. We got a letter from the Guinness Book of Records.
Love it.
And the person who beat us on that record was Michael Jackson. I guess he released his back catalogue. It was my whole life.
How did you manage that? I know what it's like being on tour. It's very tiring. And you've got 2 little kids, and you're doing all the mail order and all that stuff. I mean, you must have had a lot of energy, and you're coping with somebody who's a big, complicated person. Let's put it that way.
Well, I remember being up after midnight, many nights, like trying to fulfill orders that, I got to get out to the post office the next day. But when we went on tour, we would usually have a good friend who would come and basically be a nanny. But I would still be with the children in the daytime. And like I said, it was my whole life from the second I woke up. And I do remember if I wanted a break, I'd say to Jen, I want to go out with my girlfriends, and he would be like, when is that? I'm not sure if I can babysit. And I just think, looking back, it's like, you don't say I'm babysitting my own children.
Sorry, I'm laughing at it, but it's quite funny. I was saying to you that I've interviewed women who were involved in the 60s and 70s in the counterculture. And in some ways, of course, counterculture was super progressive. But in other ways, it was very traditional. And it's like, and when it came to the roles the sexes played, so the guys would be sitting cross-legged on beanbags, smoking weed and talking about philosophy, but who's doing the cooking? I think you said something about, even in the studio, everybody's working away, making a recording, but when it's time for, shall we have a cup of tea? Who's the person making the cup of tea?
Exactly. Yeah, it was always sort of like, we want tea. Like, will you put the kettle on? I think I was so used to doing it. I would just do it. But now, just looking back, yeah, we can be very counterculture, but we go back to these stereotypes. And so many women have been fully involved in creative projects, and then they're delegated.
They can do that, but still have to do the other stuff. I suppose that's what come over a few times. I think a lot of it was unconscious, wasn't it? Conveniently unconscious, it has to be said, I think, from the guy's point of view, to let those traditional values still have a life, even in the countercultural age.
Yeah, absolutely. But I really feel I did experience misogyny. Once we were on tour, and I was tour managing, and we played a gig in Chicago, and we had a policy that we would ask to be paid before we went on stage, because often we'd experience that then they go, we didn't make enough money and we can't pay you. So I went into this office and I just said, I'm the tour manager and like to be paid or whatever. And this big rough guy refused, hands down, like, I don't deal with women. And I just went, all right, you don't want to deal with me. Got it. I just walked out and I just called all the guys together, the band and the roadies, and I said, you come with me, so I walked back in, and then all the guys around me, and we got paid.
That was the music industry, for sure.
That was the music industry. When I left Jen, I realized I love being creative. And I really do not like the music business. I just took a sabbatical. What I wanted to do was live that domestic, normal life. So for the last 30 years, I think I've lived a pretty suburban life.
You had a very, very intense 11 years before that. You probably just needed a break.
I really needed a friggin' break. I didn't know what to do, because that's what I had done, was be in psychic TV and run a lot of TOPY. I did a lot of writing.
Again, for people who don't know TOPY, Temple Ov Psychick Youth, tell us a little bit about what it actually was from your point of view. And also, so when you were writing, what sort of things were you writing?
I was writing more the philosophical idea of how we could live our lives. Yes, that idea of religion controlling people, controlling what they did in their bedroom, but how would it be to feel free? Which is kind of ironic because I didn't feel really free in my relationship. But what is that freedom? And especially as we were just coming out of those Thatcher years and conservatism, and, you know, the country was very super repressed, and there was a depression there. For working class people, I had grown up in a working class family, grown up in Hackney, that was the poorest area per capita of Britain at that time. So with TOPY, it was, what's your idea as an individual to be free? Jen had already had this interest in Crowley and Spare, and then it went from there into sigils. And the commitment, if I remember rightly, was over 23 months doing a sigil and sending them in for 23 months. So it was that whole idea of
So this is for the community of TOPY, right? So what would they do? What would it mean? What would it mean to do a sigil?
So it was like magical invocations, but they would include like hair and blood and then orgasms. So it was like people would send them, and it was like you'd really hope that they'd be put into little plastic bags in the envelope. But they weren't always, because you carefully open the envelope and pull them out and filed, and then you would get your name. So actually I came up with the names Eden and Kali, Eden for the males and Kali for the women, before we were really, you know, the whole non-binary really came in. And then you would get a number like Kali 23 and Eden 23. And then on completion, you would get like a psychic cross pendant and a brooch and a few other things.
So let me get this right. So every month for 23 months, a devotee of the Temple of Psychic Youth would send in something, could be hair, or when you say orgasm, are you talking about some sperm in a bag?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Like on a piece of paper, like...
I don't want your job. That's all I'm going to say.
I know. It might have got to the point where I'd slice over an envelope and just like open it up and look in. But
people sending you in all sorts of strange things as part of this kind of, I suppose it was a cult in a way of some sort.
Of some sort it was. I mean, for me, it was sort of intertwined with the mail order. I actually ended up having these pen pals with people before the internet, before cell phones. And people would write these long letters, you know, like, I'm ordering this record, and I used to order Throbbing Gristle, and I'd be thinking about getting into TOPY. And then I'd write back to people. And I'm still in touch with a couple of those people today. Yeah.
So TOPY, it's a sort of cult around the band, and you're sort of mistress, as it were, in some way, of a priestess of the cult, right? But you're the person who's answering the fan mail, or you're opening up these strange offerings that people have sent.
Yeah, I mean, I can laugh about it now. You know, we took it seriously. And
what was the commitment that people were giving themselves to?
I'm trying to remember, I think it was 23 months of doing these sigils. Was it every single day? And this was before we were really talking about non-binary and trans, but the men would have the name Eden and the women would have the name Kali, and then they would get a number. So like Kali 23 and Eden 23. So then they'd write in, and then when they'd completed that 23 months, then we would send them, I think, a psychic cross, which was our logo, jewelry, booklets and other things. I just remember that, you know, there were some friendships and connections made that have lasted for decades. It was a place and a community for people to feel connected. It's before the World Wide Web.
Before social media, right, as well, isn't
Before
it?
social media, where, people have these friendships. We had one friend from Barnsley, who moved to London, came out as gay. But, what do you do if you feel isolated in a village? So they find, there's this band that I'm into, which happened to be Psychic TV. They have this organization or this community called Temple Ov Psychick Youth. How do I find out about that? And how do I get involved? So I think it really served a purpose. And then, we started to have conferences. And then we were putting out literature. I mean, we had the Psychic Bible of writings on philosophy, human rights, but right spelled R-I-T-E-S. What is our right as a human being?
It's actually one of the most interesting bits of the story in a way. I mean, you've got a band and, one end of it is quite poppy, Godstar. It's like a Syd Barrett pop song, isn't it, in a way? And you've got some much more experimental stuff. But this community / cult and this way of people belonging based around a band, and also the publication, so you're actually making stuff, making art and sending it out. That little world, I think, is fascinating. So what happened? So you'd be living in Hackney and then you move to Brighton.
So mid-80s, Hackney had some street crime, just like it does today. And there were great things about it. But I just felt that I didn't want to raise the children there. And we bought a house in Brighton with a friend of Jen's and continued our life. And we had kept Beck Road, our house there, and we used it more as an office. So we would go back and store Temple records and mail order stuff there. And a couple of people who were helping in TOPY moved to Brighton too to help us out. And then a close friend, Ossian Brown, who's worked with Death and June, done his own stuff, and David Tibet, he's a close friend.
Things are going along quite well. You're managing to have like a sort of family life whilst doing all this stuff and going on tour. Kids are sort of participating in the tours and must have been very, very fun for them. So tell us what happens next in terms of between that and Kathmandu.
We were connected with the people who ran the October Gallery in London, and they were connected to a Buddhist temple up in Scotland called Sammy Ling. So I said to Jen, let's make a holiday out of this. So we rented a little Volkswagen van and went up there. And we were greeted by a nun, Annie Wongbo, and she found us beds, and it was Jen and I and the kids. And then in the morning, she came and she said, let's go and see Lama Yeshe. So we went in and he beckoned us over and he had 4 slices of toast and he was like, I knew that you were coming. So it seemed like all auspicious. And then we found out about this project over in Kathmandu where the Buddhist community was helping to feed people. I just really said to Jen, I really want to do this. I really want to go. I knew that they were also in need of clothes, like children's clothes, and I got donations from people. We'd been invited by Panasonic to do a gig in Tokyo. All the corporations like Sony, Panasonic, they all have their own buildings and they showcase their new technology. And so Panasonic had an event space and they kitted it out in gold-plated Technique speakers, floor to ceiling. And they wanted Psychic TV to be the showcasing band.
Wow.
So we were like, yeah, and we played in Tokyo before and got a great response from people. So we worked out, that gig will pay for us to go over and then we could go to Nepal. So we went there and we did this volunteer work at Bowdenell Monastery. So we'd get up in the morning with the kids and feed people around the stupa. It was such a great way for our children to also see some people really disabled, without legs, without arms. One man who didn't have any legs and he would get around on a little skateboard. But also the smiles on people's faces. And I really got to experience people that it seemed like the less that people had materially, the more generous that they were. I feel like we were doing quite well financially with the band. I was realizing we're so blessed, we have so much. And how can we give back? But then we went off and did some trekking, and we flew into Lacklaw, which I think is the place that you fly into Everest. And then it's one of those landing strips where you look and it's like, it falls off the edge of a cliff or a small plane. And then we got a donkey and a guide, and we hiked way in the mountain to a Buddhist monastery. And that was pretty incredible with the children. Then we went back to Kathmandu, back to the Hotel Vajra, and we had a flight booked to come back. I think we'd been there maybe 3 weeks. And I just said to Jen, I had this strong intuition, not go back. And Jen was like, no, we have to go back. We've got tours, we've got this. So the next, we were all packed to leave. And the day we were meant to leave, the pilots in Nepal went on strike. So no planes were leaving. Then the next day when we'd stayed, we got a call put through to our room. Jen picked up the phone, and I hear Jen on the phone going, what happened? What did they do? They smashed our front door, with a sledgehammer? And I was just listening to this thinking we'd been robbed. And then we found out the story that Scotland Yard had arrived with something like 7 transit vans. In the dawn, we would have got home late the night before. So they knew. They tracked our flights. And then they also raided Beck Road. Both houses were raided. When we were able to get hold of our lawyer, David Gentle, he was on it, talking to Scotland Yard. We got the news. There's absolutely no charges against you. There's nothing that you had that was illegal in your house. I'm super surprised that they didn't plant something like drugs or something.
Do you think that the actual raid itself was prompted by this kind of build-up of scandal sheet press about what you were up to, what was happening in Brighton, what had been happening with you guys in Brighton, and, why the police would crash into your house at dawn and steal all your stuff?
I think it was a number of things. Well, there's definitely a backstory. There was a couple Christian journalists took umbrage with what we were doing, or being outspoken, those art films. We were working with Derek Jarman, and also made, our own what would be seen as weird films. And they had, some nudity, some sexuality, as far as I remember, no explicit sex. So there was a TV documentary made, and I believe this TV show still happens in Britain, Dispatches. I have still not seen it. That basically said that we were Satanists and that we were murdering children. And I think specifically they were saying Jen was murdering children. And it seems as if the journalists went to Dispatches, like, we can make this whole expose documentary on people that they were saying were Satanists.
Part of the background that I know to this is that at the time there'd been this, what they call the satanic panic, which was this thing going around in the mainstream media, and it's actually still going around, that there was this cabal of sort of psychopathic paedophiles who were inspired by Satanism in all sorts of rural places, North Wales and I think all around the country, who were murdering kids. Now we would say conspiracy theory, right? And it sort of erupted into public mainstream consciousness. Now, there's no doubt about that there was some awful things with paedophilia did go on, as they're still going on, right? But this was a particularly strange theory, was that it's Satanists, right? So somehow you got caught up in that?
I think they edited the films so that they were made to look satanic. And then they interviewed women. And actually, I did see a slice of one of the women being interviewed. And it's no one we've ever met. And she's in shadow. You can't see her face. She doesn't mention anyone's name. And she's saying, they made me murder my baby. And then later, when there was more of an investigation, it turns out that I think these women were in psychiatric hospitals. We'd never met them. And then the police and dispatches and the News of the World were obviously all in cahoots together, because the Sunday, which was the day I think that Scotland Yard raided our house, there was a front page story with a photo of Jen basically saying something like, Britain's Satanists killing babies. And then a week later, there was an op-ed piece by Derek Jarman, and I believe it was in the Observer, saying this is not true, these were art films, da 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 da. We spoke to our lawyer, who said there's no charges from Scotland Yard because you haven't done anything illegal. There's, they found nothing. However, if I was you, I wouldn't come back to England because you have children. And basically that the satanic panic was going on. And it was around the time of Orkney, and when all these children were taken from their homes, and it took years for these parents to get their children back. Like, they'd been placed into foster care, and it was proved that that wasn't going on. So it was a really, really traumatic time.
This picture of you guys as a happy family out there practicing Buddhism, feeding lepers, it's actually quite a contrast with that picture of somebody who's a kind of, manic Satanist, sort of bent on kind of paedophilia and killing kids, isn't it?
Absolutely. Jem became very much in the public eye before I knew him with the prostitution show at the ICA. It was discussed in Parliament. And then with Psychic TV and with TOPY, there was a narrative of own your own body, own your sexuality, even own what you do in the bedroom, and really pushing for free speech. And then, we'd gone through all those years of, the Conservative government. So it felt very, very repressive.
It's an issue at the moment as well with, freedom of speech. It sort of keeps popping up. We are quite liberal in many ways, but in others, not at all. So I think that the context you're talking about is that Genesis had some pretty bad press for his activities previously, and the authorities maybe are sort of biding their time. They're waiting for the opportunity or a reason, and which is often provided by the media.
You're absolutely right. Is the media. I look back and I go, how comes we didn't sue the News of the World? But at that point, no one had any luck. It's only been in the more recent years, and I think when the royal family were involved with the News of the World, tapping phone lines, etc., that shifted things.
When the establishment itself was the target rather than the anti-establishment. Yeah. So you received the news in Kathmandu that your place has been raided. They've stolen, effectively, let's call it what it is, a load of stuff. Did you ever get any of that back?
No. So David Gentle, our lawyer, said there's no charges against you, so you can come back. However, if I was you, I wouldn't come back because they're going to harass you. Social workers can come in and just take your children because of these claims, and we didn't want to risk it. So I phoned Scotland Yard. My house was raided, all my stuff, all archive was taken. There was no charges. Who do I talk to? Oh, you got to go through to, our basement storage department. So I got hold of this guy, explained the situation. And he goes, oh no, I ain't got that anymore. No, it's all destroyed. It's all gone. I'm completely in shock because there were videos and photos of the children's childhood, their birthday parties. They obviously didn't take everything because we did end up with some of our archive, like master tapes, and there were some things that were definitely left. I mean, I could almost laugh about it now. That's so traumatic. It was devastating. Even with myself being raised from a super young age, never to trust the police. It was still absolutely shocking. They would orchestrate a complete untruth and have that much power. to try and destroy us.
You're in a foreign country, I mean, and doing the good work, half the world away. You know, you find out that your home's been smashed into. They've taken all of your stuff and you're being accused of all this stuff. I mean, it must have been absolutely terrifying. You've got 2 little kids to deal with.
It was terrifying. All our resources and our money and everything was back in England, and it relied on us doing gigs and releasing records. We ended up losing our house in Brighton because we couldn't pay the mortgage. So we're in Kathmandu and it's like, what are we going to do? Where are we going to go? So I remember looking through my Filofax, and there was a postcard from this Mike Horowitz who we'd met in London. He'd come to our gig at Dingwalls and loved it, and came back, backstage after the show. It was like, I love what you do and let's exchange addresses. And this postcard said, if you ever need a refuge, call us. And they were in this little town called Petaluma, which is between where I live now and San Francisco. And I think they really meant, him and his wife, if you're ever on tour and you need a refuge, then call us. So we called them and we said, we need a refuge.
You make then the decision basically to become exiles. You flee, I mean, there's no other way to describe it really, to the West Coast.
And it turned out that they were good friends with Timothy Leary. They had helped Tim when he had escaped, I think, one of the prisons when he was sentenced to 30 years for having, a small spliff, which actually was his daughter's, but he was taking the brunt. And he escaped with the help of the weather people, right. I believe. Yeah, so then he was on the run, and Mike and Cindy were good friends. So we ended up at Mike and Cindy's house in Petaluma.
And at that point, Alaura O'Dell, I'm going to press pause here because I think there's no way I can squeeze all this into an hour. If you're happy to, we can see when we can reconvene. How does that sound?
That sounds brilliant. Thank you so much.
The very lovely Alaura O'Dell and her terrific stories. We're going to be back for more of those in due course to hear about her life in exile, about Winona Ryder, Timothy Leary and the split with Genesis. Links to Alaura in the show notes. She got in touch with me after hearing that previous episode when I interviewed David Rodriguez about his film about Genesis, a film that she still hasn't seen, by the way. But it's always great when people get in touch. So do be in touch. Thanks to Matthew Thomas, Ted, Jessica, and those others who have written in with suggestions. Thank you so much. And thanks to you for listening. Now, you know what I'm going to say, don't you? Let's keep listening. And I will see you further down the road, round the bend, and over the hillside for more of these tales from the other side.